She was only a sign language interpreter trying to help an elderly deaf woman who had gotten lost in the airport, and she had no way of knowing that the grateful woman was the mother of a feared crime boss in New York, nor that when the man bowed his head before her in the middle of the crowd, she would become the only person in his cold, shadow-filled world he allowed to see his heart. Announcements echoed through Terminal 3 of JFK Airport, but Ellie Carson barely heard any of them after 3 days attending a medical conference in Boston, drowning in presentations about emergency support for the deaf and techniques for conveying emotion through sign language, and all she wanted now was to collapse in her small apartment in Seattle and hold her daughter through one deep, uninterrupted sleep. She adjusted the worn brown leather strap of her backpack and followed the exhausted tide of travelers toward baggage claim until a sound made her stop short. Not a voice, but a sharp, desperate sob that cut through the airport noise like a blade. Instinct rose faster than her fatigue. She turned toward the sound, saw a semicircle of people gathered near Gate 17 around the information desk, and at its center, an elderly woman, perhaps 70, silver hair neatly pinned, her deeply lined face wet with tears as her hands flew in sharp, frantic movements. One glance was all Ellie needed to understand. The woman was signing, not pure ASL but Italian Sign Language blended with a few familiar American structures. "My phone is dead. I cannot find my son. He promised he would pick me up. Please, I just want to find my son. Please help me." The message appeared clearly in every trembling movement of those thin hands, while 3 airport staff stood frozen, their faces showing confusion and helpless sympathy, wanting to help but unable to grasp what was happening. One of them spoke loudly, enunciating every syllable as if raising his voice would magically help a deaf woman understand. The crowd whispered. Someone lifted a phone to record, but no one stepped forward. No one truly helped. Ellie did not hesitate. She slipped through the onlookers, stood before the woman, raised her hands gently and signed, "I am Ellie. I understand you. You are safe. Tell me what you need." The transformation was instant, as the woman's frantic hands slowed, her reddened eyes fixed on Ellie, her aged face breaking into a relief so profound it tightened Ellie's throat. "Thank God," the woman signed, tears still falling. "Thank God. I thought no one would understand me. No one. I understand you clearly," Ellie signed with a soft smile. "Let us figure this out together. What is your name?" "Teresa. Teresa Moretti. My phone died. My son told me he would meet me at arrivals, but it seems the gate changed. I became confused and kept asking, but no one understood me." A low anger stirred in Ellie at the thought of this frail woman struggling for 20 minutes while no one thought to grab a piece of paper or call for an interpreter, but she set the feeling aside. "All right, Teresa. We will charge your phone first and call your son. Does that sound good?" Teresa nodded again and again, her shoulders relaxing as if a weight had finally slipped away. Then she squeezed Ellie's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you. You are an angel," she signed before releasing her. "Just someone who knows how to listen," Ellie replied. As they walked to the charging station, Teresa kept glancing at her with a mix of gratitude and disbelief, and signed with gentle familiarity. "You sign beautifully. Like a native. Are you deaf?" "No, I can hear. I am an ASL interpreter at Seattle General Hospital. My job is to make sure everyone is heard." Teresa nodded with a contemplative look. "A strong woman, raising a child alone. That takes courage. Only coffee and determination," Ellie answered with a small smile as a quiet warmth stirred in her chest. When they reached the charging station, Teresa pulled an old photograph from her wallet, showing a young woman holding a newborn with dark hair and radiant eyes. "My son, Daniel. He is my whole world." Ellie looked at the picture and felt something strange rise inside her, something she could not yet name, unaware that her simple act of unconditional kindness would lead her into an entirely different world, where every glance, every word, and every bow carried layers of meaning she could never have imagined. In that fateful moment, just as Ellie helped Teresa regain her calm, and Daniel Moretti appeared like a cold wind cutting through the terminal. If you feel the story opening into a deeper, darker, more compelling world, then do not forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so that each day you can listen to more emotional and dramatic stories like this one. And before we move to the next part, where every look and every gesture between Ellie and this powerful man begins to change color, tell us where you are watching from. Leave a comment with your city and country so we know how far this journey is reaching across the world, and we truly look forward to reading your thoughts. When Teresa's phone had just enough charge to power on, She tried to navigate it, her trembling fingers prompting Ellie to gently offer help, which the woman accepted as she handed over the device. In the contacts, the most recent entry was Daniel's personal number. Ellie looked at her and signed, "May I call him for you?" Teresa nodded, lips pressed tight. Ellie dialed and waited, and after 3 rings a low male voice answered, deep, crisp, coldly controlled. "Mother?" Ellie swallowed and replied with steady calm. "Hello, I am not your mother. My name is Ellie Carson, a sign language interpreter. I am at JFK Airport with your mother. She is safe, but her phone died and she could not find you. We are near Gate 17 in the arrivals area of Terminal 3. Silence fell on the other end, not hesitance, but an assessing, calculating pause, as if someone were weighing every word. When the voice returned, it was lower, colder, edged with command. "Leave my mother there. I will arrive in 8 minutes. Do not move from her side." Ellie frowned, but kept her tone even. "I will stay with her. You do not need to worry." The call ended with no thank you, no goodbye. Ellie returned the phone to Teresa and signed his message, and the woman nodded, her eyes flickering with an emotion hard to name, a touch of relief mixed with something like worry or a familiar kind of exhaustion. "He is always like that. Always worried too much," Ellie signed. "He must love you very much." And Teresa smiled, though the smile never reached her eyes, as she answered, "Love, but distant. It is not the same as before anymore." Ellie was about to ask more when Teresa straightened suddenly, her gaze fixed on something behind Ellie, and without turning she could already feel the shift in the air, the way the airport noise dimmed, and an invisible wave made the crowd instinctively move aside. Ellie turned. A group of men in dark suits walked in perfect rhythm, their cold eyes sweeping across every corner. They did not raise their voices or make dramatic gestures, yet their presence tightened the entire space like a fist closing. In the center walked a man who made Ellie instantly understand why Teresa was so fiercely protected. Daniel Moretti, tall, mid-30s, dressed in a crisp black suit with a spotless white shirt, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to giving orders and unaccustomed to being refused. His face was sharply defined, and his dark eyes were deep and dangerously sharp. But when those eyes landed on his mother, a faint flicker passed through them, subtle and brief like the last light of day. Daniel said nothing to Ellie. He walked straight to Teresa, lifted his hands, and began to sign. "Are you all right? Did anyone bother you?" Teresa shook her head, touched his cheek gently, then signed. "She helped me. She understood me." Daniel turned to Ellie, and for a moment his gaze moved across her face, as if searching for every thought she had not yet voiced. Then, unexpectedly, he bowed his head, a deliberate, respectful, deeply meaningful gesture that made even the men around him pause in surprise. Ellie froze. She had never seen anyone bow like that, least of all a man who looked like him. When Daniel straightened, he lifted his hands again and signed slowly, each movement precise. "Thank you for helping my mother. I am grateful." Ellie responded at once, almost on reflex. She needed help. Anyone would have done the same. Daniel raised an eyebrow, almost like the ghost of a smile touching his mouth, though his eyes never softened. No, not everyone would have done the same. He pulled out his wallet, held out a thick stack of money toward her. Ellie stepped back, shaking her head. "I do not take money. I help people who need help," Daniel said in a low, rough voice. "Then, consider it a donation to your hospital, to the interpreting service." Ellie met his eyes, steady. "It is not necessary. There is no debt here." Daniel fell silent. Teresa touched his arm and signed something Ellie could not see. Daniel pressed his lips together, put his wallet away, and signed. "Then all I can say is this. My mother is the most precious thing I have. Thank you." Ellie nodded. When Daniel led his mother away, the men around them immediately closed in, forming a tight protective circle. Ellie stood still, feeling the air stir with whispers, a few people murmuring, some lifting their phones to record, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. Daniel Moretti, his name was not simply that of a wealthy businessman, and with one small act of kindness toward a stranger, she had accidentally stepped into a world where even a gentle glance could draw too much attention. Ellie remained rooted to the spot, watching Teresa and Daniel disappear into that ring of silent protection, and though she could not yet grasp everything that had just happened, something invisible had brushed against her heart. Daniel's bow, not grand, not embellished, carried a strange gravity that made her chest tighten, not from shock but from an inexplicable feeling that a man of such power could bow to her, a complete stranger. She turned away, heading toward the taxi stand, trying to slip out of the swelling whispers. A boy of about 12 passed by, telling his mother, "Mom, I saw that guy online before, Daniel something. I think he is really dangerous." The woman pulled her son faster, eyes scanning the terminal with caution. Ellie lowered her head, her heartbeat sharp and hard. She did not chase rumors, and she had no interest in the world of powerful men, yet the name Daniel Moretti stirred something familiar. When she reached her hotel near the airport, she unlocked her phone, her nerves still taut. A photo of her standing beside Teresa was already circulating online. In the picture, Daniel bowed in front of her, his face turned slightly yet still commanding. Within minutes, hundreds of shares and thousands of comments flooded in. Who is she that Daniel Moretti bows to her in public? My God, I did not think that man even knew how to bow. Who is this girl? Has anyone found her information yet? Is she his new girlfriend? No, she does not look like the type of woman he goes for. Ellie dropped the phone onto the seat, her breath uneven, her palms damp. She had no idea that a simple act, a natural gesture of kindness, had slipped into a camera lens and become something the world now watched. She had only helped a lost mother. She had done nothing wrong, but the world did not operate on simple right and wrong. In the hours that followed, people began digging up her information. They found an old LinkedIn profile where she once shared that she worked at Seattle General Hospital and was a single mother with a 6-year-old daughter. Someone even dug up a 3-year-old post about Gracie loving dinosaurs and signing their names in ASL. The comments kept pouring in, some supportive, calling her a kind soul in a careless world, others skeptical, and some sounding like warnings. She should be careful. That man is not normal. Ellie shut down her social media. She sat in the dark hotel room staring at the ceiling, feeling everything slip out of her control, as if she had opened a door, and on the other side lay a world she could never have imagined. The next day, Ellie returned to Seattle. Gracie ran into her arms, her small hands flying in familiar signs. "Where did you go so long? I missed you so much." Ellie held her close, kissing her forehead and trying to hide the unease twisting inside her. She wanted life to return to what it had been, a simple routine of helping hospital patients, making dinner, telling bedtime stories. But deep inside she knew the truth. Daniel's bow had not been just polite. It had been the beginning of something else, something larger, deeper, and far more dangerous. Ellie did not yet know what awaited her, but she knew she could not retreat. Not after seeing the desperation in Teresa's eyes, not after watching Daniel feared by many bow like a lost son before a stranger's kindness. 3 days after returning to Seattle, Ellie still could not find her old rhythm again. She tried to keep everything normal, taking Gracie to school, arriving at work on time, preparing dinner, telling bedtime stories, yet everything felt like a thin veneer stretched over something trembling inside her. She was unraveling beneath the surface, especially now that the video of Daniel bowing to her in the airport had surpassed more than 1 million views, shared across multiple social platforms under sensational headlines like "The Woman Who Made a Mafia Boss Bow" or "A Tender Moment from New York's Most Feared Man Toward a Quiet Angel." Online articles began digging deeper, and though Ellie had temporarily locked her personal accounts, her information kept surfacing everywhere. People found her workplace, old photos of her and Gracie at a charity art show, and someone even posted pictures of the preschool Gracie attended. On Monday morning, when Ellie walked into the hospital lobby, a few nurses turned and whispered. One tried to approach her with a fake, casual question, just to stare more closely, and a longtime colleague pulled her aside, voice low. "Ellie, you do not have to answer if you do not want to, but do you actually know Daniel Moretti?" Ellie shook her head, weary. "No, I only helped his mother when she was lost. Truly nothing more." The colleague nodded, but her eyes still held doubt. On her way home, Ellie stopped at her usual grocery store, but the owner, who was normally warm, now forced an awkward smile, and the young cashier stared at her as if she had stepped out of a television drama. The sensation of being watched, examined, judged, seeped into every step she took. When she arrived home, Gracie ran to the door and signed, "Mommy is home." But this time Ellie noticed a stranger standing on the porch, a woman in business attire holding a small camera, sunglasses hiding but not softening her intrusive curiosity. "Miss Carson, I am with the local news channel. We would love to interview you. Your story has inspired millions. Do you have a moment? Ellie gently pulled Gracie behind her and replied calmly, I have nothing more to say. I only did what anyone should do. The reporter smiled, not kindly. But not everyone gets Mr. Moretti to bow in the middle of an airport. Ellie did not answer. She simply closed the door. That night, she sat on the sofa with Gracie asleep in her lap, the television casting soft light onto the ceiling, though she could not focus on anything. Her phone vibrated on the table, an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A familiar low voice came through, quiet and steady. Are you all right? Ellie recognized Daniel immediately and drew a tense breath. I am fine, but it seems the world will not leave me alone. Daniel was silent for a few seconds before saying, I am sorry. I did not mean for you to become a target. Then why did you bow to me? You knew exactly what would happen. I did, but I could not stop myself. My mother has not felt truly heard by anyone for years. You did what an entire airport system failed to do. You made her feel seen. Ellie leaned back, exhausted. I only did what was right. I know. And that is exactly what makes you the most dangerous kind of person in my world, because real kindness is something many fear. Ellie let out a thin, humorless laugh. I cannot tell if that is a compliment or a warning. Daniel did not laugh, but his voice softened. I want to help, at least to protect your daughter from those stairs. How? With men following me? Armed guards? I do not want to live in fear. I am not offering that. I am offering an invitation. If you want, my mother would like to see you again. Somewhere quiet. Just for afternoon tea. Ellie stayed silent for a long time as rain began tapping gently on the window, her emotions tangled and unsteady. Yet somewhere deep inside she felt something urging her not to close this door completely, not after seeing the gratitude in Teresa's eyes, not after seeing Daniel bow without hesitation, and not after everything that had happened simply because she had done the right thing. 3 days after the call with Daniel, Ellie received a strange parcel with no sender's name, only her address written in a soft, slanted script like the handwriting of an older woman. The cream-colored envelope had no logo and no courier label, so ordinary it made her more cautious. She held it, considered a moment, then slowly opened it. Inside was a simple card made of thick ivory paper, carrying a faint scent of dried lavender. The handwritten lines in purple ink leaned slightly but were careful and clear. Not Daniel's handwriting, but that of a woman. Someone who had written many letters in her life. Ellie read the note, her hands trembling. Dear Ellie, this is Teresa Moretti, the deaf woman you helped that day at the airport. Thank you for being the first person in many years to stop and truly listen to me. What you gave me was more than help, it was grace. I had stopped believing there was still room in this world for unconditional kindness until you placed your hand on my shoulder and told me, you are safe. Those words made me want to believe again. I know I cannot repay you in the ways of the world my son lives in, nor do I intend to. I only wish to invite you to my home to drink warm tea in the garden and talk as two women, without noise, without expectation, without obligation. If you agree, call the number below and someone will pick you up precisely on time. If you refuse, I understand completely. I do not insist. I only hope to see you again, not for reputation but for gratitude. Teresa Moretti. Ellie read the letter again more slowly, as though each word were rising softly into the air. Every line was simple, unadorned, yet carried a sincerity that tightened her throat. She set the card down and sat motionless for a long time, caught between opposing feelings. Part of her wanted to avoid any more trouble, especially with Gracie so young and vulnerable. Yet another part, the part that had sat beside Teresa when she felt the whole world turning its back, could not walk away. She still remembered the way Teresa's frail hands had gripped hers, clinging as if holding on to the last bit of steadiness in chaos. It had not been the gaze of someone powerful, but the gaze of a mother. That day, Ellie placed the card on the dining table beside Gracie's half-finished cup of cocoa and watched her daughter lying on the floor arranging plastic dinosaur pieces, quietly signing their names the way Ellie had taught her, and suddenly realized her child was growing up in a world where kindness could become dangerous and helping someone might expose a person to endless scrutiny. The fear of that weighed more heavily than anything else. She did not want Gracie to live in such a world, not if she could do something, anything, to make it different. The next morning, Ellie called the number in the card. A gentle, polite female voice answered, asked for her name, and confirmed the time. Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. A car will pick you up at this address. You do not need to prepare anything. We are glad you accepted." Ellie set down the phone, her heart beating faster, not from fear but from an unnamed sensation, as if she were about to step into a place where assumptions would be stripped away, and only human truth would remain: pain, gratitude, and all the words people were too afraid to speak. And more than anything, she knew that if she refused, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have happened if she had agreed to that cup of tea. On Saturday afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, a black car pulled up in front of Ellie's neighborhood gate, quiet yet impossible to overlook, and the driver stepped out in a gray suit, his face expressionless as he spoke with polite clarity. "Miss Carson, I am here to take you to Mrs. Teresa Moretti's home." Ellie nodded and glanced down at her pale blue dress, as if to reassure herself that it was simple and respectful enough. Then, after asking a neighbor to watch Gracie, she stepped into the car with a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. The ride lasted nearly an hour, moving from crowded city streets toward the quiet northern suburbs, until they turned onto a road shaded by late-season red maples, and Ellie lifted her head as the house came into view like something out of an old painting. A stately 3-story mansion with dark gray shingles, arched stained glass windows, and a deep wraparound porch framed by lavender and blooming hydrangeas, whose fragrance drifted softly on the breeze. Yet beneath the serenity lay a sternness, not overt threat but the silence of power, the kind that made people avoid questions. The driver opened the door for her and quietly withdrew. Ellie climbed the stone steps, but before she could knock, the door opened to reveal a small, kind-faced middle-aged woman with neatly pinned hair, who smiled, nodded in greeting, and signed, "Welcome. Mrs. Teresa is waiting for you in the garden." Ellie followed her through a stone-tiled hallway lined with black and white photographs, some familiar, including one of a very young Daniel sitting beside Teresa on a wooden bench, his face not yet carved with the hardness it carried now. The corridor led to a small garden behind the house, where a round wrought iron table covered with a pristine lace cloth stood between 2 chairs, and Teresa was already seated, dressed in a beige knit dress, her silver hair softly framing her face, her eyes brightening when she saw Ellie. She signed her greeting with hands still steady and graceful, and Ellie smiled as she signed back, "Thank you for inviting me." Teresa nodded and gestured to the chair opposite. "I did not think you would come. I only wanted to talk, truly just talk." Ellie sat and poured herself tea, the scent of jasmine drifting through the quiet space as the 2 women, one older, one younger, spoke through a language without sound yet filled with weight. Teresa told Ellie about the years after the stroke that took her hearing, the isolation, the feeling of being pushed to the margins even within her own family, and Ellie never interrupted, only watched her with deep attention and occasional nods of understanding. Teresa signed slowly, at times hesitantly, as if choosing the exact shape of a feeling. "My son, he is good, but he lives in a world where softness is seen as wrong. He has not shared anything with me in a very long time," Ellie replied gently. "But he came for you." And he bowed. "Not everyone can do that." Teresa smiled, her eyes carrying a fragile hope. "It has been so long since I saw his eyes look the way they did that day. Thank you, Ellie, not only for helping me, but for giving him a moment to be himself again." They fell quiet, the only sound the whisper of leaves in the breeze. And Ellie felt something inside her soften, not curiosity, not recklessness, but understanding, and she knew this visit was not the end of anything but the opening of the first chapter. As the sun drifted west, its golden light settling over the garden, Ellie was preparing to excuse herself when Teresa lifted a hand, hesitant. "My son is on his way home. If you are not in a hurry, I would like you to meet him in a calmer moment." Ellie hesitated, unease flickering through her, but she nodded. Deep down, she knew this meeting was inevitable if she remained connected to this family, and especially because Teresa wished it. Only a few minutes passed before footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Daniel appeared at the garden entrance wearing a white shirt with sleeves rolled up and black trousers, his expression unreadable. He paused when he saw Ellie sitting beside his mother, his gaze lingering on her face before he moved no closer. Ellie rose, steadying her voice. "Hello, Daniel." Daniel gave a slight nod. No smile, no offered hand, then turned to Teresa and signed in quick, efficient movements. "Are you well?" Teresa nodded and responded briefly, signing about their conversation. Daniel looked at Ellie again, this time more sharply, as if assessing an unexpected presence within a space he controlled completely. He said nothing to her, simply pulled out a chair and sat beside his mother, his demeanor making clear that this encounter was a formality. The contrast between mother and son was unmistakable. Teresa radiated warmth that made anyone open their heart, while Daniel was a fortress, high and cold, built from years of caution and silence. No friendly glance, no polite small talk. Everything about him carried restraint. Ellie remained composed, yet she felt the divide between them like a solid wall. Teresa tried to draw the two of them closer with gentle conversation, mentioning that Ellie had learned sign language as a teenager because her best friend had been deaf, but Daniel showed no reaction, asking nothing, merely nodding as if recording a fact that did not merit further comment. Ellie sensed the invisible barrier he had built between them, not the coldness of apathy, but the vigilance of someone who refused to reveal even curiosity, because in his world everything must be contained. When Ellie described her work at the hospital, Daniel's eyes narrowed not with interest but with calculated assessment, as though measuring relevance and risk. She understood then that he did not see her as a person but as an unknown variable. In Daniel's world, survival depended on control. When Teresa excused herself to fetch a plate of homemade cookies, Ellie and Daniel were left alone at the table under the rustling leaves. Ellie set down her teacup and looked directly at him, keeping her voice level. "I understand you are protecting your mother, and I have no intention of intruding on anything in your family." Daniel turned toward her, his gaze no longer sharp but still not softened. "You do not understand. I am not only protecting my mother, I protect everything. People do not survive in my world if they believe everyone arrives with good intentions." Ellie did not look away. "I did not come with any intention. I simply could not walk away from someone who needed help." Daniel was silent, his expression unchanged, though a faint, almost imperceptible uncertainty flickered at the edge of his eyes. He said nothing more. Teresa returned with a plate of warm cookies, and the atmosphere eased as she sat down. Ellie managed a small, genuine smile the first of the afternoon and signed to Teresa, "They smell wonderful. I am sure Gracie would love them." Teresa beamed. Daniel simply watched. None of the three knew that this quiet afternoon tea was the first small shift in the armor Daniel had worn for far too long, and that the woman sitting across from him with her steady, calm, and unembellished kindness had begun to touch something no one else had dared to reach, the part of him that was still human. 1 week after the afternoon tea at the Moretti estate, Ellie received a brief message from an unknown number containing only a few words. "Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. My mother wants you to teach me more about ASL. Can you come?" No name, no greeting, but she knew instantly it was Daniel. His cold, unembellished way of speaking that was neither pleading nor rude, simply a statement leaving the choice to her. Ellie sat still for a moment before replying, "I will come." The next day she returned to the estate under a heavy gray sky, the air thick with the promise of rain. This time Teresa herself opened the door, unable to hide the brightness in her eyes as she signed quickly. He agreed. He will not say it, but a mother knows when her son wants to understand her again. Ellie smiled and signed back, "I will try my best, but it may not be easy." Teresa nodded with a mixture of gratitude and worry. Daniel was waiting in the reading room behind the main hall, standing beside a towering bookshelf, sleeves rolled up, his back to the window. He did not look at her when he said, "I have exactly 1 hour. Tell me what you need." Ellie set her bag on a chair and quietly unpacked a few small books and a printed ASL emotion chart she often used with children. She handed him the first sheet. "We start with emotions. Not vocabulary, not commands. Emotions. If you cannot express how you feel, every other sign becomes meaningless." Daniel glanced at the paper, an unfamiliar flicker crossing his eyes as he read the bold words. Happy, sad, afraid, angry, grateful, disappointed, love. He pressed the corner of his mouth in that almost smile he used whenever he encountered something he considered unnecessary. "I do not think emotions require hand movements." Ellie kept her tone steady. "Then we can start with something easier. Happy. I will show you." She lifted her hands, moving her fingers gently from her chest outward, the motion soft and luminous like a small beam of light expanding. She waited. Daniel stood motionless for a few seconds before copying her gesture, but it was stiff, mechanical, like a machine mimicking a human. Ellie did not admonish him. She simply stepped closer and adjusted the position of his fingers. "Softer. You do not command a feeling. You acknowledge it. Again." The second attempt was better. He said nothing, only lowered his eyes to the page, then unexpectedly asked, "How about grateful?" Ellie did not answer right away. She stepped closer, raised both hands slowly, touched one to her lips, and extended it outward, the other gently open. This means grateful, but expression is what makes people believe you truly feel it. He repeated the sign with more focus, less rigidity, though his eyes remained empty. Ellie watched him and asked softly, "When was the last time you truly felt grateful?" Daniel lifted his head, and his gaze darkened. "Are you teaching language or digging into memory?" Ellie did not retreat. "If you want to talk to your mother, then you must learn more than movements. She does not need a perfect signer. She needs a son who wants to understand her." Silence stretched between them. Daniel looked down at his hands, set the paper on the table, then turned back to the chart and practiced each sign in the order she showed. Still stiff, still guarded, but undeniably trying not to please her, but for something deeper inside him. Perhaps a long-buried longing. The lesson ended after close to an hour. While Ellie packed her things, Daniel stood by the window watching the garden as the first drops of rain darkened the stones. He did not turn around when he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "My mother thinks very highly of you. She has not written a handwritten letter to anyone in many years." Ellie nodded gently. "I care about her, and I think she deserves a son who understands what she wants to say, with words or with hands." Daniel did not respond, but when Ellie walked toward the door, she saw him in the reflection of the glass practicing the sign for grateful again and again, slower, softer, and for the first time his eyes were no longer empty. A week after their first lesson, Ellie returned to the Moretti estate at Daniel's unexpected request, this time not through Teresa's invitation or the familiar driver, but through a short message from Daniel himself. "This afternoon, 4 o'clock, someone will pick you up." The car arrived exactly on time, and when Ellie stepped into the familiar study, she was surprised to see it transformed. A large whiteboard set up in the corner, neatly arranged ASL flashcards, warmer lighting softening the room. Daniel stood there, not as rigid as before, and greeted her with the signed phrase, "Good afternoon," still awkward but genuinely offered. Ellie smiled and nodded, taking out her materials, but Daniel spoke before they began, his voice lower and slower than usual. "Do you ever feel left behind, even while living among the people closest to you?" Ellie studied him for a moment before nodding. "Yes. When my parents divorced, I stayed with my mother, but they were both always busy. I felt invisible in my own home. Only an old cat listened to me." Daniel's gaze drifted toward something distant on the floor. "I was 6 when my mother lost her hearing after a fever. My father never learned sign language. Never. Every time she signed, he frowned and said, 'Stop it.' I never understood why she cried, why she sat at the window for hours without speaking. No one explained." Ellie remained silent. Daniel continued, his voice gaining the weight of long-buried memories. "When I was 8, my father started taking me to meetings. He never told me what to do, just to watch. Once, someone raised his voice at him. The next day that man disappeared. I did not ask. I learned not to ask." He turned to her then, and for the first time Ellie saw something human in his eyes, an exhaustion not from fear or power but from years of holding everything in. "I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, if I did everything correctly, she would talk to me again, but she could not, and I did not know how to cross that distance until I saw you at the airport." Ellie stepped closer, her voice soft. "And you realized she had been speaking all along, you just had no language to hear her." Daniel did not nod, but something in him stilled, like her words had landed where they needed to. He sat, resting his hands on the table. "I used to know sign language. A little. She taught me before I started school. But when my father called it weak, I forced myself to forget. I learned to command. I learned silence, and I thought I had protected everything. But every time I look at her, I know I lost the most important thing." Ellie placed her hand on the sheet, showing the ASL word for understanding, and slid it toward him. "You did not lose it. You just got lost, and she is still there, still waiting for you. One sign, one moment, one look." Daniel took the paper, gripping it gently as if holding something fragile, and said nothing. The lesson that day did not last long, but Ellie knew she had witnessed something no one else had seen in many years. A small fracture in the armor built from fear, discipline, and lifelong silence, a crack delicate yet enough for the first light to slip through. 2 days after the deeply emotional lesson with Daniel, Ellie returned to the Moretti estate on a mild autumn morning, the sunlight soft, the air crisp and clear, like a quiet promise of something good waiting ahead. And it was Teresa who opened the door, her warm smile dissolving whatever traces of distance remained between them. Without an interpreter and without introductions, Ellie and Teresa spoke through familiar signs that had become as natural as breath, and Teresa led her to the back garden where they usually had tea. But today, instead of a lace tablecloth and delicate porcelain cups, a basket of yarn, colorful skeins, and 2 wooden knitting needles sat on the table. Teresa signed with eyes sparkling like a child sharing her favorite toy. "I thought you might like to learn this." And Ellie smiled brightly as she signed. "I have never tried, but I would love to learn." Teresa nodded and her hands moved with practiced ease, guiding Ellie through looping the yarn, casting the first stitch, then helping her slowly, step by step, with quiet patience. Amid the threads of yarn and the birdsong drifting from the branches above, time seemed to slow, soften, and settle into something tender. Their connection required no effort, only presence. Teresa signed stories from her youth in Napoli, summers salted with sea air, evenings spent by the hearth with her mother knitting scarves for the coming winter. She signed, "I lost my hearing not long after moving to America. Everything so loud it hurt my head, and then suddenly, absolute silence. At first I thought I was finally resting, but the silence stayed forever, and no one asked if I was all right." Ellie paused, lifting her gaze to meet Teresa's, her heart tightening as she signed. "I saw my mother go quiet like that after my father left. She was not deaf, but she stopped speaking, and I was just a child who did not understand that silence can also be a cry for help." Teresa nodded, her eyes full of understanding. Then she placed her hand gently over Ellie's and signed, "I see myself in you, strong, listening, carrying a hurt buried very deep." Ellie smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with tears. And in that moment, 2 women from different generations and different worlds connected, not through spoken words but through a language only those who have endured hurt can truly understand. Afterward, Teresa led Ellie to a small room at the end of the upstairs hallway, filled with light from a wide window and lined with family photographs, but one picture stood apart in its own frame on a small table near the window. It showed Daniel as a small child, perhaps 4 years old, sitting in Teresa's lap, his tiny hand forming the sign for mother, through a radiant smile. Teresa lifted the picture gently and signed, "I keep this with me always." It was the last day he signed with me before he stopped entirely. He forgot each word little by little, but I did not. I remember every time he looked at me and tried to say, "I love you" with his hands. Ellie looked at the photograph, then at Teresa, and for the first time she saw something fragile in the small, elderly woman. Not fragility from age, but from a love held too tightly for too long, unable to flow. Ellie squeezed her hand and signed softly, "You did not lose it. You only need to wait for him to find it again." Teresa looked at her for a long moment, then gently placed the photo back on the table as if setting down a pain she had carried for years. When Ellie prepared to leave, Teresa embraced her not with signs but with trembling, warm arms, an embrace that held not only affection but acceptance, as though Ellie had truly become part of this family, not because of reputation, not because of Daniel's bow, but because she had quietly touched Teresa's heart with the simplest of things, patience and the willingness to listen. That evening, just as Ellie returned home and set her bag down, the phone rang in sharp, urgent bursts, like a storm warning, and on the other end was a familiar male voice, but this time breathless and strained as if squeezed by fear. "Miss Carson, this is Marco. Something has happened to Mr. Daniel. He was ambushed in Midtown and is being moved to a safe location. Please do not leave your house until someone arrives for you." Ellie froze in the middle of her living room, her grip tightening around the phone, her heartbeat stumbling out of rhythm, and in her mind flashed the wounded look in Daniel's eyes during their lesson, the first time his hands formed the sign for gratitude, then the image of Teresa smiling beneath the sunlit garden as she handed Ellie the faded photograph, and now all of it felt as if it could vanish in a single second. Ellie ran to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out at the street where the lights still glowed, and people walked as though nothing in the world had shifted, even as something inside her had collapsed entirely. Nearly an hour later, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of her home, and a man in a suit hurried up the steps, ringing the bell with a curt, low voice. "Miss Ellie, we are under orders to take you to safety." Ellie did not ask questions. She shoved her phone into her pocket and rushed out the door, with only one desperate hope beating in her chest, that Daniel was still alive. The car sped into the night, racing through empty streets with the distant wail of an escort siren behind them, each echo like the pounding of frantic hearts, and at a disguised warehouse along the river on the western edge of Manhattan, Ellie was ushered inside where the dim yellow lights, the sharp scent of Rush disinfectant, and the faint metallic smell of blood closed around her like a tightening fist. Daniel lay on a long chair, his shirt torn open at the shoulder, blood smeared across his right arm, while a doctor stitched quickly under the beam of a handheld flashlight. And though Daniel's face tightened in pain, he did not groan, did not flinch, only gripped the edge of the chair with his uninjured hand. Ellie rushed toward him, and when Daniel lifted his head and saw her, the coldness in his eyes melted for the first time. He did not look surprised or embarrassed, only as if he had been waiting for her. Marco stood beside them, speaking in quick, clipped phrases. They ambushed his car on the way back from a meeting. 3 vehicles boxed him in and opened fire. Looks like an inside leak from the Southern faction. We barely fought them off in time. Daniel took 2 rounds, one in the shoulder and one in the upper arm. Ellie knelt beside him, her eyes wild with worry, though her voice remained steady. "You are insane. Why did you not bring more protection?" And Daniel looked at her with a hoarse voice softened by something unguarded. "I did, and it was not the guns or Marco. It was you. Do not ask why. It is just that when I saw you, I knew I could not die tonight." Ellie stared at him, unable to speak, and the words did not sound like the Daniel she knew, because the man bleeding in front of her was not the fearsome leader everyone whispered about, but a boy who had learned to survive by staying silent in a house ruled by power and hurt, now trying, at last, to speak with his hands. After the doctor finished bandaging him, Daniel was moved to a back room to rest, and Ellie refused to leave his side. Teresa arrived nearly an hour later, Marco supporting her trembling frame as she signed urgently, "Is Daniel all right?" And Ellie signed back, "He is safe, but you must rest. He would not want to see you exhausted." Teresa embraced Ellie with shaking arms before turning toward her son. That night Ellie sat in an old chair by the window, staring out toward the Hudson River where the lights of New Jersey flickered like whispered confessions in the dark, and she could not sleep, could not cry, only sit in the chill air listening to the rain, tapping softly against the rusted metal roof, while one thought replayed over and over, Daniel gripping the chair, pale and bleeding, yet holding on only long enough to say, "I already had protection. It was you." And in that moment, Ellie knew there was no turning back, not from pity but because her heart had already chosen. At dawn, before the first streak of sunlight could break through the gray clouds blanketing New York, Ellie woke to a soft knock, and Marco's steady voice, "Miss Carson, apologies for waking you, but we must move you and young Gracie to a secure location." Ellie sat up sharply, caught between the haze of broken sleep and the harshness of reality, glanced around the makeshift room where Daniel lay only a few doors away, then nodded. Less than half an hour later, she returned to her apartment with 2 silent men shadowing her every step, their eyes sweeping each corner as if danger could bloom from the smallest forgotten object. Ellie lifted Gracie from her bed and the sleepy child signed, "What is happening, Mama? Where are we going?" And Ellie signed back with a fragile smile, "A special little trip, sweetheart. We will stay somewhere new for a few days." Gracie nodded, still too young to grasp the weight of the moment, but trusting her mother's calm, and she dressed quietly, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. They left the apartment in under 10 minutes, their belongings reduced to 2 small bags and a scratched silver-gray suitcase weathered by years of use, and the black SUV carried them over the Queensboro Bridge, into the quiet northern suburbs, until it stopped before a simple 2-story wooden house hidden behind late-season maple trees. No cameras, no guards, only a low fence and a small backyard garden with wilting tomato plants. Marco stepped out, opened the door for Ellie and Gracie, then handed her a ring of keys. "This house belonged to a senior member years ago. It has been empty, but the security systems are still active and concealed. No one will find you unless Daniel gives the order." Inside, the scent of old wood and sun-baked dust wrapped around Ellie like the echo of her grandmother's home, and Gracie wandered through the living room, exploring corners as if beginning a new adventure, her laughter lifting when she found an old piano in the corner and tapped a few keys before looking back at her mother with bright excitement. Ellie brushed her daughter's hair gently and sank into the sofa, letting out a long breath for the first time in nearly 2 days. Marco stood at the doorway, his voice still firm but edged with something softer. "Miss Carson, Daniel asked me to tell you this is the only place that can guarantee absolute safety for you and your daughter. He will make contact when the situation stabilizes, if anything unusual happens, press the red button on this device. He handed her a small, rubber-cased phone with no function except emergency calls, and Ellie took it silently. When Marco left and the door closed behind him, a new kind of quiet filled the house. No sirens, no curious neighbors, no trace of the life she knew, only the whisper of wind through the windows, and Gracie's delighted giggle as she discovered a porcelain doll on the bookshelf. Ellie sat motionless for a long time, the emergency phone in her hand, her heart a swirl of fear and relief, dread and hope, and then she lifted her gaze to her daughter whose small eyes glowed like a candle in the storm. And she knew she could not break, not when someone still needed her strength, not when Daniel might be facing darkness alone for choosing to protect her and Gracie, and not when her own heart had begun to beat to a rhythm she never expected. 2 days after moving into the safe house, Ellie slowly adjusted to the temporary rhythm of hiding, while Gracie remained cheerful and carefree, playing in the backyard, drawing chalk dinosaurs on the cement, and naming each one with the signs her mother had taught her, delighted by the small garden, the old wooden swing hanging from a maple tree, and the cast-iron oven in the kitchen that reminded her of a fairy tale. Ellie rose early each morning, brewed coffee, wrote in her journal, and sent brief messages to Marco for updates. And though Daniel had not contacted her directly, she was told he was past the danger and recovering, so she tried to keep life steady for her daughter, but the quiet did not last. That morning, when Ellie stepped to the mailbox at the end of the dirt path, she found an envelope with no postmark, no sender, only a single line written in bold red ink across the center. "Your daughter is adorable." A shame if anything were to happen to her, and Ellie froze in the middle of the road, her eyes locked on the words as if they could burst into flames, her hands trembling as she tore it open to find a glossy photograph of Gracie, sitting in the yard with her puzzle blocks the afternoon before. Not an old picture, not something pulled from the internet, but a close, crystal-clear shot taken secretly, as if someone had been standing only a few feet away. Ellie spun around, scanning the bright sky and the whispering trees, but everything now felt sinister, and she ran inside, slammed the door, pulled the curtains tight, and pressed the red emergency button on the secure phone. Less than 3 minutes later, Marco called back, his voice low and sharp. "Report everything," and Ellie could not hold her composure, breathless as she said, "Someone approached the house. They sent a photo of Gracie. They are watching us. I do not know who they are, but they know exactly where we are." Marco paused for one heavy second before replying, "I will be there in 15 minutes. Do not leave the house. Lock every door. Keep Gracie beside you. Do not let her see any of this." And Ellie hung up, rushing into the living room where Gracie looked up from her paper dolls with a bright smile. "Mommy, I made this for you. It looks like you," and Ellie nodded, pulling her child into a tight embrace, signing gently, "Play in the room for a bit. I need to make a phone call." And the little girl nodded, unaware that her innocence was now the most threatened thing in Ellie's world. When Marco arrived with 2 fully armed men whose presence was no longer concealed, they swept the entire house, the yard, the roof, the chimney, even the small stretch of woods behind the house, but found nothing, no footprints, no unfamiliar equipment, no sign of intruders. Yet the photograph in Ellie's hand made denial impossible. Marco's jaw tightened as he studied it, his voice dropping. "This is a warning. They want to force Daniel to surface or attack his only vulnerability. This time it is not about power, it is about blood, about family." And Ellie sat silently on the chair, her eyes fixed on the image, knowing she had ceased to be an outsider long ago, and whatever choice she might make from now on would come with its own cost. But even if she could turn back time, she would still have walked toward Teresa in that airport. The problem now was that the price was dangling over her little girl's head, and nothing in the world was more terrifying. Daniel stood before a one-way observation window in a hidden room behind the temporary headquarters, his shoulders still bandaged, though his eyes showed no sign of weakness, holding a copy of the photo of Gracie, the edges crumpled from his grip. Marco stood a few steps away in silence, the room taut with a quiet that felt like a wire stretched to its breaking point, and Daniel stared at the child's face in the picture before speaking, his voice rough and fractured. "I brought them into this. I knew it the moment I bowed to her." Marco stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, a wordless gesture of support, but Daniel had learned to live without comfort since he was a boy. Except this time silence was not enough, coldness was not enough. Strategies and control and vigilance could not keep Ellie and Gracie safe, unless he admitted the one truth he had denied for years. After 30 minutes, he requested a call to the safe house, and when Ellie's face appeared on the screen, he faltered at the sight of her tired, sleepless eyes with Gracie curled in her lap, clutching her worn rabbit. The child's arms wrapped around it like clinging to a world still untouched by cruelty, and Ellie said nothing, only watched him, as if waiting for something she could not name. Daniel inhaled deeply and raised his hands to sign for the first time without guidance. "I am sorry." And when Ellie did not react, he signed again, slower. "I pulled you and your daughter into this world. I believed that if I controlled everything, no one would be hurt, but I was wrong." Ellie blinked, then signed softly. "Love is not wrong. You just have to show it at the right time." And Daniel nodded, looking at her not as a man standing behind a fortress of emotional distance, but as someone confronting his deepest fear. And he spoke aloud. "I spent my whole life believing that the only way to survive was to shut every door, but you walked through without knocking. You and Gracie, and I do not know when it happened, but each time I saw you I remembered how my mother used to smile, and I cannot lose anyone else." Ellie held Gracie closer, her hands trembling though her eyes softened, and Daniel continued, "I am not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that if needed I will disappear entirely to keep you both safe. But if you allow it, I want to stay and fight for that safety." Silence swept both sides of the call until Ellie finally signed 3 gentle words. "We are here," and Daniel clenched his fist, closing his eyes as if he had climbed a mountain no one else had ever dared. And when the call ended, everything had begun, because he was no longer hiding behind armor or burying his words beneath ice. He had let his emotions speak in the one language Ellie's heart could understand, and that alone was enough for him to realize that for the first time in many long years, he was no longer fighting alone. That afternoon, as the sky shifted into a pale pink washed with soft gray, and the last rays of daylight spilled across the backyard of the safe house, Ellie stood alone by the railing with a warm cup of tea in her hands, her gaze resting on the distant line of trees, where the golden late autumn leaves drifted down like words left unspoken. Gracie was asleep inside with her stuffed rabbit tucked neatly beside her, and Ellie finally had a brief moment of quiet after so many tense days, though she could not explain why her heart was beating faster, or why an unnamed intuition kept tugging at her until the familiar black car came to a stop outside, and Daniel stepped out, wearing a charcoal coat, his shoulder still bandaged and his movements careful, his deep eyes changed by something softer, perhaps resolve no longer hidden. Ellie opened the door before he could knock, saying nothing as she looked at him for several seconds before stepping back to let him in, the air between them thick with everything left unsaid. And he paused in the center of the living room, where the glow of the fireplace softened the sharp lines of his face. Ellie set her tea aside and murmured, "You should not be here." But Daniel held her gaze and replied, "I know, but I could not stay away any longer." And she remained silent, though her hands tightened unconsciously. He moved toward her, each step weighted with years of emotions pressed down and ignored, and said, "I spent my whole life believing everything I touched would disappear or break my mother, the people who trusted me, and then you. I thought distance was safer for you and Gracie, but I was wrong." And Ellie met his eyes without a trace of fear as she whispered, "You were not wrong for being afraid. We all have something to protect. You simply do not have to do that alone." Daniel exhaled, as if a stone had been lifted from his chest, and said, "I never imagined wanting to stay in a world without power or strategy, or men with guns at my back, only a woman with eyes that truly listen, and a little girl who calls me uncle with her hands." And Ellie let out a trembling smile. Daniel stepped closer, until only a breath separated them, and said, "If I told you I want to protect you, not out of debt, but because my heart stopped belonging to me from the moment you signed the word emotion, would you believe me?" And Ellie did not answer with words, but lifted her hand to his chest and signed with both hands. "I trust you." Daniel stared at her, caught between astonishment and relief, like a child finally embraced after a long nightmare, then placed his hand over hers and, with no fear or restraint left, leaned down to kiss her. A soft confession hidden for too long, like the last locked door in his heart finally opening to let the light in. Ellie closed her eyes and wrapped her arms around him, as if holding him tightly might heal every wound, and outside the window the wind stirred the maple leaves, their gentle fall echoing the quiet rhythm of two hearts finding their home after years of distance. In that moment they were no longer two people from opposing worlds, but two souls speaking a language beyond words, where love could finally be spoken with the whole heart. A week after that first kiss in the secluded cabin in the woods, once every threat had been resolved, Ellie and Gracie returned to the Moretti estate on a warm, late autumn morning. The familiar black car rolled to a stop before the great iron gate, where ivy still clung to the stone walls as if nothing had changed. Though everything inside Ellie had. Marco opened the gate, wearing a rare smile when he saw her holding Gracie, and the little girl signed hello to him, making Marco laugh aloud and bow with exaggerated respect as if greeting a tiny princess. When the front doors of the estate opened, Teresa stood waiting in a cream knit dress and the shawl she had made herself, her face glowing with joy and her eyes shimmering as Ellie and Gracie crossed the threshold before she rushed forward to embrace them both, signing over and over that she was grateful they were safe, that she had prayed each day, that she knew Daniel would keep his promise to protect them. Ellie squeezed her hand gently and signed, "We missed you, and Gracie is very excited to have your biscotti again," which made Gracie nod eagerly and sign the word cookie, prompting Teresa to laugh and cry at the same time. The estate felt reborn with the sound of a child's laughter and the warmth of a family forming from pieces that never seemed meant to fit. Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, not hurried, not wearing the cold authority he once carried, but simply a man with a faint, softened smile and eyes that sought only Ellie. They did not need words when their eyes met, only a quiet nod as if everything had already been decided in the silence between them. Lunch was served in the garden behind the estate where maple leaves still clung to the wooden benches, and Teresa sat between Ellie and Gracie, signing to both with such effortless joy that even the cook watching from a distance could not help but smile. Daniel watched quietly before rising to set a small box before Ellie, and when she gave him a puzzled look and opened it, she found a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like the hand sign for family. Ellie froze as her heart trembled, and Daniel signed 3 words, "I choose you," followed by 4 more, "to walk with me." Gracie looked up, delighted by the pendant, and exclaimed, "Mommy looks like a fairy tale princess," then signed to Daniel, "Uncle is family." Teresa pulled Gracie close, tears sliding freely down her cheeks with no rush to wipe them away, and Ellie reached for Daniel's hand and squeezed it before signing, "I am here." And in that sun-filled garden, with leaves whispering overhead and love moving in quiet gestures and warm glances, they understood they had finally returned to the place they truly belonged, not a house, but another heart. One early winter afternoon, as the sky turned gray and the wind began slipping through the cracks around the window frames, the small study room inside the Moretti estate filled once more with Gracie's soft giggles and the rustling of flashcards being shuffled. Daniel sat beside Ellie, his hands carefully spelling the names of different animals in sign language so he could teach them back to Gracie, while the little girl burst into laughter each time he made a mistake and exaggerated it with a silly face. And from the corner of the room, Teresa watched them with her unfinished knitted scarf resting in her lap, her eyes never leaving her son, shining with a mixture of astonishment and a strange, tender relief. Nearly 2 months had passed since the ambush, and Daniel was no longer the quiet man who only spoke when absolutely necessary, for he had begun to use his hands more than his words, and every lesson with Ellie was no longer a structured class but a journey peeling back the layers of emotion he had locked away for so many years. That day, Ellie chose to teach him something new, something more difficult than vocabulary, something rooted in emotion itself. She placed 3 small photographs on the table, each capturing a real moment of life: a little boy hugging a dog in a hospital, an elderly man sitting alone at an empty dinner table, and a father carrying his child on his shoulders in a crowded street. She looked at Daniel with a seriousness she did not often show, and signed for him to describe the emotion in each picture using only his hands, not his voice, allowing his heart to do the work. Daniel hesitated and stared at the photographs for a long moment, the room growing so quiet they could hear the wind brushing against the window panes. Gracie nestled closer to Teresa, sensing something important though she did not understand the lesson. Daniel lifted his hands toward the first picture of the boy and the dog, signing slowly the word friendship, then the word trust, and finally hope. His eyes stayed on the image, but when he spoke, his voice was directed only to Ellie, telling her that he once had a dog when he was young, the only creature who listened to him when his mother could no longer hear, and he would speak to it in sign language until his father found out and forced him to stop. Daniel shifted to the second image of the elderly man alone at the table, signing loneliness, then freezing mid-gesture as if something tightened in his throat. and finally signing that he once believed he would end up like that, coming home each day to an empty chair and a silence he could not break. Ellie remained still, not interrupting, and Teresa rested a comforting hand on Gracie's shoulder while the child looked at Daniel with wide, wondering eyes. Then came the final photograph of the father carrying his child, and Daniel raised his hands again, not slowly this time but with decisive honesty, signing protection, then love, and finally family. He turned to Ellie, his voice low but steady, saying he did not know how to be a father, but if he were ever given the chance, he wanted to learn. Ellie leaned forward, placed her hand over his, and signed that he had already begun by protecting and listening. Daniel did not blink, then suddenly lifted his hands again and spelled out, letter by letter, the 3 words he had never signed to anyone in his entire life: I love you. Ellie pressed her lips together as tears spilled before she could stop them, and Teresa covered her mouth with her trembling hand as she pulled Gracie close, the little girl looking up at her and unconsciously mimicking the exact same sign Daniel had just made. Daniel looked at Ellie as if, for the first time, he had truly been allowed to live as a whole human being, not in silence, not in fragments, not in fear, but in truth, in a language his heart had finally learned. And the remarkable thing was, he no longer needed to speak out loud, because the moment his hands rose, the entire world around him understood. The next morning, the Moretti estate rested beneath a gentle veil of sunlight that fell like silk through the tall glass windows, casting soft golden patches across the wooden floor light that felt like the rare promise of a peaceful day. In the living room, Teresa sat in her old velvet armchair by the fireplace, holding a children's picture book whose opening page was filled with colorful sign language illustrations. Gracie sat across from her, her tiny legs dangling above the floor, eyes wide with attention as she followed every page and every movement of Teresa's hands. She giggled each time Teresa acted out a new word with an exaggerated expression. And somehow, though she had never been formally taught, Gracie understood everything. Teresa never used her voice, yet she was the best storyteller Gracie had ever known. Outside the doorway, Daniel stood quietly watching them, his arms folded, his eyes lit with a softness Ellie had never seen before. She stood beside him, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. He turned to her and murmured, I haven't seen my mother smile like that since my father died. Ellie smiled, her gaze still fixed on the two in the living room. Maybe she's reliving something she lost a long time ago, she whispered. When the story ended, Gracie wrapped her arms around Teresa's waist and signed thank you with both hands, her clear eyes shining with absolute trust. Touched beyond words, Teresa hugged her tightly, then pulled from her pocket a tiny multicolored knitted bracelet, slipping it onto Gracie's wrist with a care that felt almost ceremonial. Gracie gasped at the bracelet, then signed softly, Is this a lucky charm, Grandma? Teresa nodded, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes overflowing with warmth. Ellie entered the room and lifted her daughter into her arms. When she looked at Teresa, gratitude filled her expression like quiet light. Teresa rested a hand on Ellie's shoulder and signed slowly, I did not just get my son back. I gained a granddaughter and a daughter. Emotion welled in Ellie's chest, and she embraced Teresa, feeling for the first time in her life what it was like to be held and protected by a mother. Dinner that evening was prepared by all 3 women in the wide, sunlit kitchen. Teresa taught Ellie how to make Southern-style gnocchi, while Gracie took charge of folding napkins, stealing small bites of fresh cheese when she thought no one was looking. The room filled with the sounds of spoons tapping pots, soft laughter, the rustle of curtains stirred by the wind, and comfortable silences that felt like home. Daniel entered last and stopped short, surprised to see 3 generations bustling around the kitchen, as if they had all lived together for years. Teresa turned to him and signed playfully, Tonight, you will eat with the 3 most important women in your life. Daniel looked at Ellie, then at Gracie twirling around the table with bright, sparkling eyes, and he nodded, as though acknowledging a truth that had already taken root inside him. After dinner, they sat together on the porch. Gracie curled in Daniel's lap, her head resting against his chest, fingers fiddling with the buttons of his shirt, while Ellie leaned against his mother's shoulder. The 2 women watched the stars together in peaceful silence. Suddenly, Teresa signed something quickly, and Daniel frowned, asking, What did you say, Mom? She repeated it slowly. Family is not what we choose in the beginning, but it is the place we choose to return to. Daniel went still, then signed back with a small, unforced smile. I made the right choice. And have you forgiven me? Teresa shook her head gently. There was never anything to forgive. I was only waiting for you to open your heart. Later that night, when the entire house had gone quiet, only wind and steady breathing drifting from the rooms, Teresa sat alone on the porch, her fingers brushing over the unfinished scarf in her lap. She looked up at the night sky and smiled, soundless but full, and anyone watching would have understood. It was the smile of a mother who had finally witnessed the miracle she prayed for. The family she once believed shattered was now being stitched back together by the love of a young woman, the innocence of a child, and a son who had finally learned how to speak with his heart. On a spring afternoon, in the sun-washed garden of the Moretti estate, Gracie's laughter rang out clear and bright like wind chimes. She was running around the small fountain, waving the little paper flag that Daniel and Ellie had made with her earlier that morning. Teresa sat on a wooden bench beneath a maple tree sprouting tender new leaves, her gaze warm and full as she watched her granddaughter play. Meanwhile, Daniel and Ellie stood side by side, their hands intertwined, quietly savoring a moment of peace that seemed so ordinary, yet, to them, was a miracle they had spent a lifetime never knowing how to reach. Daniel tilted his head toward Ellie and slowly signed the 3 words he once struggled to express but now had become a natural part of the language between them. "I love you." Ellie didn't answer with spoken words. She simply smiled and signed back with both hands. "I understand, and I feel the same." Their love did not need grand gestures or loud declarations. It only needed honesty and a way to hear each other through spoken words, through the eyes, or through the quiet dance of fingers moving gently in the air. This story began with a small moment in an airport where a young woman who knew sign language stopped to help an elderly mother no one else had taken the time to notice. She did not know that this simple act of kindness would change the course of her life, leading her toward love, connection, forgiveness, and a new family pieced together from fragments that once seemed beyond repair. We often forget that a single look of understanding, a hand extended at the right moment, or an act of love offered without reason, can be enough to heal even the deepest wounds hidden inside another person. This story is not merely about the Mafia, nor is it solely about power or survival. It is about a special language that does not require sound, yet speaks straight to the heart. It is the language of love, of understanding, of family, and of trust. My friend, how do you feel after following this emotional journey? Have you ever met someone who could not speak, yet whose heart was full of things longing to be shared? Have you ever been swept into the rush of life and forgotten that love can begin from the smallest gesture? We would be truly grateful to hear the feelings that rose within you, your thoughts, your reflections, or even a similar story you have witnessed or experienced. If this story has brought you something meaningful, please remember to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with those you care about. Because who knows, one small action from you may bring encouragement or healing to someone who needs it today. Thank you for joining us through this heartfelt journey. We hope that each day you find a reason to smile, something to hope for, and someone to love. Wishing you good health, joy, and peace in every moment. Until next time, take care, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.